To do so, we hope you'll turn your camera on if you're a member of the general public joining to listen. We ask that you leave your camera off until it is time for public comment at the end of the call. The last thing I will remind, or two things I'll remind folks, we ask that you not use the chat unless absolutely necessary, as it gets a little distracting for anybody watching who may be using a screen reader or other technologies. And one last request, anytime you speak, we ask that you introduce yourself at least first name first when you start speaking, so everybody knows who is on the call. I will start off. This is Barrick Abramson with Confluence Policy and Strategy Group, and we are thrilled to have everybody on today's call. Today is when we're going to start digging into the meaty work. On that first call, it was really good, I thought, to just hear where everybody was coming into the conversation and some of the big picture thoughts on what we're going to need to be able to attack and address here. Today, we're going to lay out what is the scope of work, the sequence, get your input on some of those pieces. I'll share what is going to be our approach to the work. And then we're going to dig right into it, getting your thoughts on some of the meaty issues. But what I'd like to do first is bring us back pre-holidays, pre-New Year, and re-ground us in where we were. So I'm going to go around the room and ask everybody once again to introduce yourself. And what organization, constituency, or point of view you believe you're here to represent. And if you've got some thoughts on your reflections from our December meeting, things like something that surprised you or a big takeaway or something you heard from another member of the subcommittee that stood out to you. And I'm going to go around the room, and I'll start with Jennifer and then go to Cassidy. If you just introduce yourself and share your reflections from our first meeting together.
I'm Jennifer Casera, and I've worked with older adults and disabled adults off and on for 30 years as a caregiver, case manager. So I guess I bring to it more of the perspective of those needing that assistance and those working with those that need that assistance.
Thanks, Jennifer. I'll go to Cassidy and then Anais.
I'm Cassidy Roberts. I work at Disability Law Colorado. I'm a community access attorney there. So I do our housing work. As far as my reflection from December, I guess I was just really excited and impressed with all the perspectives that were brought to the table. And yeah, I just really enjoyed our conversation. So I look forward to today's meeting.
And Anais, and correct me if I'm mispronouncing your name, and then I'll go to Shelley after you.
Oh, you did great. Anais Campbell. I'm an occupational therapist and a disability advocate with the ARC of Larimer County, and we focus primarily on individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And I did have some reflections from the last meeting. Primarily, like Cassidy said, I appreciated the variety of perspectives that span this issue. I learned a lot about the financing lasagna that developers have to kind of build, and those challenges, that perspectives that I'm not as familiar with have to deal with. And so I really appreciate the diversity here, and hopefully that'll create a diverse solution.
Great, thank you. I'll go to Shelley, and then I believe that's Paul.
Good morning, Shelley Marquez. I'm the president of Mercy Housing Mountain Plains. We are a affordable housing developer that provides service-enriched housing. So we have resident services on site. I think for me, my reflection from our meeting last month was just the diverse perspectives and just the need to dig a little bit deeper to understand like what is our starting point as we think about the work for this task force. And so really pleased to be on the call and part of the conversation.
Thanks, Shelley. Paul, and then Brian, please.
Paul Brady with God and Civic Architects, kind of representing the designers in the world and our developer clients. I was also impressed with the breadth of the experience on the call, but specifically more than just kind of the physical access components that are in the design documents we use, but the broader scope of accessibility.
Thanks. Brian, and then Karen, please.
Good morning, everyone. Brian Rosbert. I'm the Executive Director of Housing Colorado. We're a nonprofit membership association of affordable housing industry folks. And I'm reflecting on December's meeting. feels like such a long time ago, but I think what's been said around the diversity of perspective, I think is really helpful here. Not only do we have folks who are in the business of building things, we have folks who are in the business of working directly with folks with disabilities. And so I think, the marriage of those two pieces is what's going to be vital for our work, is where does experience meet the built environment in a lot of ways. And so just happy to be here again and good to see you all.
Thanks, Brian. Karen.
Good morning, everyone. I am Karen Kallenberg. I'm the executive director for our state organization of Habitat for Humanity. We have 25 affiliates that are building for-sale affordable housing in about 45 communities across the state. And I just appreciated the opportunity to, get outside of my normal housing box and just talking to folks that do housing, but talk, as many of you have already said, with different perspectives, and look at it, look at what we're doing and look at the needs for Coloradoans with a different perspective.
Thank you, Karen. And although I'm not going to pester him and invite him back on camera, I do want to acknowledge Josh Winkler from the Lieutenant Governor's office. I think you all know the Lieutenant Governor is chairing the task force, and she and her chief of staff and her senior advisor, Josh Winkler, have a particularly strong interest in the work of this task force and the subcommittees. So Josh will be joining us for most meetings, and I think we may see Lieutenant Governor pop in from time to time as well. But Josh, appreciate you being here. With all of that said, I want to re-ground us in our work. And before I do that, I also want to talk about the timeline. And I'll go through that at two different points. Our obligation as a subcommittee is to submit a report with our recommendations by December 1st of this year, which we may sit here in January and say, that's a year away, we have plenty of time. What I'm going to do is remind us of the tasks we have, and this subcommittee in particular is going to need to be looking at a lot of data and research, from available housing inventory to projections on future need. The other thing that is going to be important for us to consider, although we are legislatively required to send our recommendations to the task force by December 1st, if we think there are things that we're going to propose that will require legislative action, I want us to at least be aware of that and how we're sequencing things. It's pretty standard procedure that the governor rolls out his budget in the first week of November. So us giving him ideas that mean we want him to spend something in December isn't going to work so well unless we're ready to wait another year. And the quality of our work and comprehensiveness of our work is the first and foremost priority. But I want to put that on our radars. The other thing that's happening in that October and November window is our legislators are starting to identify which are the 5 bills each of them are going to carry. That doesn't mean we won't have access to legislation if we're not there. But to the extent we have early ideas of things that we think may be included in our December 1st report, it would help that to get things into that timeline. Now, all of that said, what that means is we're probably going to want to have at least the framework and the basics of our ideas around September or October, so that we're spending November really refining, fine-tuning, and workshopping the details of those ideas. When I look at that, that means that we need to have the bulk of our investigative work and our exploratory work and our discussions about topics done by the end of the summer and into July and August, so that we're then moving into conversations about what does any of those conversations mean. And most likely what we will do is start putting some early concepts together as we tackle the tasks. So what I'm going to do now is re-ground us first in what the legislation specifically directs us to do, and then just in some of the conversations that we've had. And I know you see this on your agenda, but I'm going to read it for the benefit of the conversation now and anybody watching. The legislation says that the purpose of the Housing Subcommittee is to identify barriers to securing and enjoying secure and affordable, accessible and attainable housing for persons with disabilities, and to make recommendations for addressing those barriers. The specific deliverables we're tasked with meeting: we are required to submit a report with our findings and recommendations outlining the current need for and the inventory of accessible housing in Colorado the projected increased need for accessible housing in the next decade, and recommendations to meet future housing demand, including financing for low-income housing development and any statutory requirements to the task force on or before December 1st, 2024. I don't want to get too intimidating, but basically we're being asked to solve the housing crisis for an entire community of Coloradans who don't have that access right now. When we've talked about it, it really distills into four big chunks of conversations. The inventory of accessible housing in Colorado right now, and really understanding that, getting into what the projected increased need is over the next decade. What are the recommendations to meet that demand? And what are ideas for financing for low-income housing development? Along the way, we're going to lean on all of you, one, for your expertise, your professional and lived experience, and the networks that you represent, but also on that last point to help us understand and identify who else we need to talk to. We know that this group is not in and of itself going to solve financing for accessible housing and affordable housing. What we want to do is brainstorm the ideas and identify the experts we need to talk to, the data we need to gather, and the conversations we need to bring together. It's some big work. And so our approach to this is going to be to overlap multiple conversations across several meetings. My proposal, and I want to throw this out and get everybody's thoughts on this and how we can strengthen it, is to take one issue and first have an initial just brainstorming conversation. For example, if we wanted to talk about recommendations to meet the demand, we would, in this conversation, just start understanding where everybody is coming into that discussion. What your initial ideas, just off the cuff or based on your experience, are. Then we would continue that conversation at our next meeting. In between, we would gather some of the things that you identify would be needed to support that. For example, if you tell us, well, we need data on how many people need this housing, or we need data on this, or we want to hear from people on the housing development, or on the financing side, or on the permitting side, or maybe you want to hear from cities about zoning. We would then bring to the second part of the conversation that information you've asked for. We would split that second call. So let's talk about, say, a February call. The first half of it would be building on today's call. The second half would be to begin that brainstorming on the next topic. And maybe it's, for example, financing for low-income housing development. And you all would help us brainstorm the things we need to know, the things we need to talk about, so that each meeting you're able to do some brainstorming on a new topic, some workshopping of the topic that we previously discussed and that we provided you some research for. And then on the third call, we would start really workshopping proposals. So it kind of follows a sequence of brainstorm, we aggregate and acquire the information you've asked for. We have a second conversation to talk about that information. And on the third call, we're then workshopping the ideas and starting to develop our recommendations. And we would overlap with two different topics every month. So let me pause there and just open it to the floor for one, any clarifying questions about the work we're required to do, and two, your reactions to that broad level, high view of the framework to approach this. Anais, jump in, please.
Yeah. And I might be overthinking this a little bit, but I wonder what benefit there would be in us defining what we mean by affordable, accessible, and attainable to really kind of give that framework for what we mean by those things and work from there. Curious what the group thinks.
I love that idea. And it was actually in my notes to spend some time on that, but I want to respond to the group's thoughts on that and on the overall framework.
I agree that would be helpful. Also understanding what, Shelley Marquez, with Mercy Housing. So I would agree with a nice comments around having that framework, but also understanding what the needs are before we start reaching out to partners to really understand what policies are in place, what zoning restrictions, things of that nature, but really who are we trying to serve and what are the needs would be extremely helpful.
Thank you, Shelley. Other thoughts on the 10,000-foot view that we're taking? Cassidy, please jump in.
Yeah, I wanted to clarify the difference between the second and third kind of meeting that you described.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So my thinking, and I think it's going to have to be fluid, and I want to be responsive to all of you. The idea is that during the first meeting, you've told us, hey, to even really dig into this issue, we need to know some more about A, B, and C. So we would provide that between meetings 1 and 2. Meeting 2 would then be getting into that substance and having conversations. Maybe you've asked us to bring some experts in. Maybe it's to talk about a specific piece of data or research. It might start the early nascent stages of developing recommendations, but I didn't want to give those too short of a time. So the third meeting would be exclusively focused on developing solutions and recommendations based on call number 2.
That makes sense. Thank you.
And I want to be clear that this is not going to be a perfect system. There may be some topic where you say, hey, on call number 2, we've got it. We need to require this. And you may say after the third call, we've still got to learn some more and keep going. It's more a sequencing so that you don't feel that new topic needs to be solved right on the spot.
Yeah, and I'll just say I particularly appreciate some time to percolate offline before coming back and maybe thinking of steps forward. So I like that idea.
Other thoughts on this structure or clarifying questions about what we are being tasked with doing?
The structure sounds good. I guess just to clarify, we're going to have to cover multiple topics kind of concurrently within that schedule, correct?
That's absolutely. And my anticipation is that on any one call, we're tackling 2 topics.
Okay.
One might be call number 2 for the topic, and then we're starting call number 1 for the next topic. And part of this, frankly, is to get through all of them. Part of it also is my experience is it's helpful to have a little bit of left brain and right brain activity that we're able to be creatively brainstorming and thinking on one, and then we've got to get really wonky and specific on the other topic.
Hi, this is Brian from Housing Colorado. I'm looking at these bullets, and I think they're good. They're big. We're gonna have lots of meat to chew on, I think, in these. And just I guess offering myself is just happy to be a part of digging up some of that information if need be, at least in the affordable world. I think we're definitely gonna have our work cut out for us, even putting like a number on the inventory, because I think one thing for us to also consider in our work is possibly where this fits in with current legislative conversations. There's a couple of competing like strategic growth bills out there that are going to be looking at inventory needs across the state, and it might be interesting for us to try and influence that process as well to make sure that any work that's done in that arena, whether it's a statewide housing needs assessment or regional needs assessments, that those include accessibility numbers, and to include this conversation in that one, I guess, is one way to say it. So I think that's great. I also would possibly throw out there, an hour and a half a month isn't a whole lot of time. So I'm more than happy to think about, like, even as we get towards the fall, if we wanted to do like a day-long retreat or something like that to get some of these things written down and see each other face to face. If that's an opportunity, I think that might be something that we might need to do in this, is to really bang out some of this stuff, is to get together and really finalize things.
Thanks, Brian. I really appreciate that. And let me just offer some thoughts, and I'll work backwards. I agree with you. 90 minutes for the next 7 months is probably going to be tough to tackle the kind of work that when I look at the broader work, as you've alluded to, on affordable housing, I don't know anybody who's been able to tackle that in 7 meetings. I think we are more likely than not going to ask this group some of those months to find a second time to meet. I would be completely open to the idea of us getting together for a longer session. I think what I would want to be very thoughtful of, and we'll talk to each member individually, is how accessible it is for people to take off and join in a physical in-person place for a day. I want to make sure that people are all able to contribute. Working backwards, also to your point about what's happening in the legislature, I'm really glad you raised that. Obviously, housing and affordable housing and things like transit-oriented development and other issues are a top priority for this governor as well as for legislative leaders on both sides, and there's a lot of activity going there. If it would be helpful for this group, we would be happy to reach out to bipartisan legislative leaders and see if they're able to join for some of our meetings and offer some insights and hear from this group. We're doing that with some of the other subcommittees, and I think you're right. It's important that we not entirely separate from efforts where we may be able to leverage the work that they're doing. So I really appreciate you raising that, Brian. Any other thoughts, or are we ready to dig into some work? Seeing none, I'm going to go right there. And this was raised, and it was already on my mind before we go into a specific topics. People have raised, what do we mean when we say accessible? What do we mean when we say affordable? What do we mean when we're talking about the broader inventory? Some of this obviously has legal definitions. But what I want to do first is just get what it means in everyday plain language to the members of this group when we throw these words out. So my first question, and I'll tee up, I try to give people a little warning and you'll hear me rambling while I give you the chance to think. So Karen, I'm going to go to you first, and then Brian, I'll go to you. And my question is going to be, when I say the inventory of accessible housing, what does accessible housing even mean to you? And alongside that, what does the inventory of it mean? Because we may be talking about geographic, we could talk ownership versus rental. We can mean a lot of different things. So would love your thoughts, Karen, when I say the inventory of accessible housing, what just in the plainest language does that bring to mind for you?
I'm a bit of a processor, however. This is the first time you've made me go first. Again, inventory in general is what's available, right? What's available for the population that we're trying to serve. And I do feel like, one of the things we try to communicate is that we have to look at the entire housing continuum. So it isn't just rentals or home ownership. It's everything from homeless individuals that need accessible housing have access to it, all the way to, are there home ownership opportunities for individuals as well?
Thanks, Karen. Brian, to you, and I'll expand on it. If somebody says, hey, we've got 40% of the inventory is available in these one-bedroom apartments in Durango, it sounds like we've solved it. Is that the case? Or how nuanced and what are kind of the sub-issues we need to think about when we throw out terms inventory and accessible?
Sure. Thank you. Again, Brian Rosbert with Housing Colorado. I think there's a lot of like technical terms that we can examine and use when we're talking about accessible housing. We can talk about type A units, type B units, universal design. There's a lot out there in terms of what we mean by accessible. The layering of those kind of really technical ways of understanding what a particular unit is for a particular person. And I think, that's one thing that we can lose sight of sometimes when we're talking units, is to lose sight of the people that we're considering and that we care about. But when we layer on that technical side of things with what does it mean to be attainable or affordable, when we're talking inventory, I think the inventory number goes down drastically when we sort of start layering on all of these things. And so if we're talking about an accessible unit, that's that's affordable, which means somebody's not spending more than 30% of their income on housing, we are very quickly talking about some select units and some select spaces. And so, you know, I guess I'll end my answer there. There's a lot more I could say, but yeah.
No, I appreciate that. And you teed up what will be my next question. After we go around here, I do want to start talking about what we mean when we say affordable. It can mean a lot of different things to different folks. There's the 30% measure, but sticking to the question of what do we mean when we say the inventory of, and when we say accessible housing, without getting into it being financially accessible or affordable, Shelley, to you and then to Paul, how should we be thinking or talking, or what is the range of things we need to put on the table when we talk inventory and when we talk accessible?
Thank you for that. Shelley Marquez, Mercy Housing. So when I think about accessible as an affordable housing developer, I mean, there are requirements for new development that we have for accessible housing. But I guess the question that comes up for me is like, who are we developing for? Because accessible for someone that is, you know, we do permanent supportive housing. And so, you know, that is serving a population that may have mental health needs or, so I got kind of go back to who is it for? That's what we need to understand when we say accessible, because there is some development that's done around trauma-informed care, and, you know, understanding the needs. So I kind of go back to what are the needs, and then how do we meet those needs with developments? And then what are the requirements that our financing agencies? So HUD has requirements, CHAPA may have some requirements, and those are some of the questions we really need to dig into to understand what are the existing requirements, and then how do we build off of that? Because is it enough? Can we do more? If we're talking about making recommendations for legislative action, then we really need to be able to have some base points to know we're building off of that.
Shelley, thank you. And I want to particularly, thank you for clarifying and offering even better language than what the statute and certainly I did when it says accessibility. I think you distilled it. Who are we talking about making homes available for? And what does that mean? I also appreciate you flagging the difference in the requirements and standards of some of our different federal and state agencies. And I think probably one of the things we'll need to do is pull those together as one of the research and readings and read those in between some meetings and come back and talk about, are those standards going to be the floor or are they going to be the ceiling for what we recommend here in Colorado? Paul, I'm going to go to you and then Anais on this question of how do you think of inventory? And when I say accessibility or quote Shelley, when I say who are we building for? What are the things that come to mind for you and how you think inventory and how you think about who we need to be making sure units are accessible for?
Paul Brady, Garden Sudic. I guess one of my main goals being on here is to default to the definitions that are in the documents that kind of guide this discussion as much as possible. So as far as the inventory, I default to the occupancy classifications that are in both the building code and the tied to the federal fair housing and those federal regulations. And so, for instance, you have like R4 occupancies and institutional occupancies. So that's your nursing housing, group homes, assisted living. I'm assuming we're not talking about that. I'm also assuming we're not talking about the R1 occupancies, which is your hotels. Instead, we're focused on R2 and R3 occupancies, which is permanent or long occupancies, apartments, rentals, for sale, single family, townhomes, that type of thing. And then the type of occupants, this is where I'm going to be really challenged, but within ANSI and some of those documents, they talk about accessible units, type A, type B, type C, and then units with communication features. Where we start to get into trauma-informed design or some of these other populations, that's where those documents don't maybe govern that. And that's where it gets really hard for me, but that's kind of the framework I work within.
Thanks, Paul. I'm going to go to Anais and then Cassidy, and really zeroing in on this. When we say inventory, or excuse me, when we say who are we building for, Anais, what comes to mind to you? Because the statute just says for Coloradans with disabilities. We obviously know we're not talking about a single life for people or single traits and needs. So when you think of who we're building for and therefore how we need to think about accessibility, what's on your mind?
Yeah, so Anais Campbell, and I'm with the ARC. And you know, since we service intellectual and developmental disabilities, those are more of the negative, or not the negative, I'm sorry, the more invisible disabilities, right? So those are the disabilities that maybe physical accessibility doesn't quite cover. And so I want to answer the accessibility first, because I know who I've been working with and who I serve and who I'm thinking when we're talking about solutions. I'm thinking about cognitively accessible as well as physical accessibility. So what that looks like is not just the built environment, but trained administrators, trained staff within those communities that know how to communicate with these individuals. It means on-site supports that can provide an ongoing support, as opposed to just, oh, you have housing, check mark. For individuals with intellectual disabilities, homelessness is still such a danger even after finding housing. And so providing ongoing supports on site, that to me represents accessibility. And community accessibility. A lot of the clients, a lot of the individuals that I serve require things like public transportation and pedestrian safety. So when I think about accessibility, that also comes into play. When I want to think about what inventory is, right? Like Paul was saying, how can these people live and age in place permanently? How can they thrive, feel like they're belong in that community? That to me also means accessibility. So when I think of inventory, I think of permanent, available, and ready to be supportive of those individuals who need that cognitive accessibility, in addition to the physical piece as well.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Cassidy and then Jennifer with the same question of when we think about accessibility, or in the simpler terms or more direct that Shelley offered, who are we talking about building for? What comes to your mind?
Yeah, I think, disability is a very inclusive term, and it includes a lot of folks. So when I'm thinking about like disability and accessibility in the housing space, I think, structurally, places need to be designed in a way that accommodates people with all types of disabilities. So Paul was kind of touching on that a bit. And then Anais was as well, a place that's, I guess, structurally inclusive for people with disabilities, and they're able to actually use the space, all parts of the space, as an able-bodied person would. And then also geographically is very important. There's units in every single part of the state. They're near transit centers for folks who rely on public transportation to live independent lives. And then I think affordability actually is, for me, part of this accessibility conversation, because I think a big thing about what makes housing accessible to a lot of people with disabilities is that they can get a unit, they can afford to get a unit. And then when folks are transitioning out of units, cost is a huge barrier, or institutions into a unit, cost is a huge barrier for them. And then there are other barriers, such as, needing an ID or other documents to get to even apply for an apartment or something like that once they're transitioning out of, a mental health institution or, a nursing home or something like that. Folks are needing certain documents, identification, they're needing funds to even access housing. So I would include that in my framing of accessibility as well.
Appreciate that. And you've also teed up what will be the next two pieces of today's conversation, which is first going to be around what do we mean when we say affordability, and then we're going to get into the inventory question and how we want to approach our work on that. Before I go there, Jennifer, I want to just stick to the basic of when we say accessibility or accessible homes, holding off for right now on are they affordable, are they attainable, and really sticking to who are we talking about building homes or making or modifying properties to be accessible for?
When I look at accessibility, I don't just look at, if they can afford it. It's where are they? If we have houses in Durango and everybody's needing housing in Denver, that's not meeting them where they're at. But meeting them where they're at is not just a location. It's also providing for not just their physical, but also their psychological and other needs. We have places in the state where there's not public access to transportation. I live in a town where we don't even have sidewalks. So those with wheelchairs and stuff are in the road trying to get places. So when you say accessibility, you have to look at the whole person and the problem. We can build an apartment, but now are they just trapped in that apartment because they can't get where they need to be or get the care that they need to be? So it's not just a house, it's a community that needs to accept the accessibility for those that have seen and not seen illnesses. I work a lot with Alzheimer's patients, and they are not understood. Their needs may not be met because of the environments that they're being put in or placed in. And it's the same thing with other mental health disabilities. They need additional support, both physical and mental support. So I think the accessibility is meeting these people where they are and meeting the needs that they have.
Thank you, Jennifer. I really appreciate you and everybody highlighting that this is a complex thing. Even if we talk about the physical building itself, where some people who've spent less time in the space may say, oh, so we're talking about how many homes have a ramp to the door or have an accessible hallway and bathroom. To your point, Jennifer, it's also the community where they're based. And to others people's points, it's not always the physical disability. There are other issues to be considering here. We're going to spend the bulk of today's call in a little bit on the inventory question because it's something that we're specifically tasked with. Before we do that, I want to offer or invite a conversation on affordability. And I will grant everybody that we're dealing with some wonky language here that none of these can be easily put into silos. When I say accessible, affordable, attainable, you can't talk about those all separately. I'm going to try to just tease out how we're all thinking about it to better inform how we structure the conversations. And I want to talk about affordable. And I will just name when we say affordable, there is the long-term affordability, there is the rent versus own, and all of the complications. Cassidy mentioned even having the documentation to apply for some of these. But I want to talk about strictly the financial side of affordability. And yes, that does include accessing the financial tools in our communities to access it. We'll get to inventory in a minute and where things are located. I really want to get people's plain language thoughts, and I want to go outside of how the government may define it of 30% of your income, or somebody may define low-income housing. I think we know Colorado is in a unique time, as is the rest of the country, on home prices. But I want to hear how you think about what does it mean when I say, is this home affordable? And Anais, I'm mixing it up. I'm going to go to you first and then to Paul, kind of going in a different direction every time.
Okay. Yeah, this one I'm a little black and white in because a lot of the clients I serve rely heavily on Social Security income. And so that's what I think of as affordability. These are individuals that, due to their disability, are not able to work substantially. And for 2024, the amount that they receive for Social Security is $943 a month. So 30% of that would be what, 280 something, right? And so when we think about affordability, and here affordability for a one-bedroom apartment is, $1,200. That for those individuals with Social Security income, those individuals considered having extremely low income, that's just not accessible or affordable. So when I think about affordability, I think of, is Joe, who's on Social Security, is he able to afford this? Joe can't work and he relies on this income. And so those are the people that I'm scooping up in that moment when I think of affordability.
Thank you, Anais. I'm going to go to Paul and then to Shelley. What does is it affordable mean to you? How do you compute that?
So Paul, I guess in my mind, I kind of have two broad buckets. One is the general market, and the other is the subsidized market. And so the example Anais suggested, excuse me, is one that challenges my buckets because I think the number of people on Social Security probably exceeds the special population bucket, where you're able to use subsidized funding or subsidized vehicles to make that work. So there's probably a third bucket that needs to happen. But I don't think we should lose sight of the general market bucket because maybe we can have more impact if we find language that affects that population than really well-written language that affects a very small subset through a subsidized program.
Thanks, Paul. Shelley and then Brian. I tell you, is it affordable? How do you think about that?
Thank you. Shelley Marquez, Mercy Housing. So I immediately, my thought process goes probably into, to use Paul's analogy, that subsidized market. What I look at, what is going to build affordable housing? It is through through programs that provide those subsidies. But the way affordable housing is defined in low-income housing tax credit world, it's that 30 to 80% area median income is what is determined as affordable, and that's what HUD utilizes. Whether you're looking at subsidized, non-subsidized, but most of your Community Reinvestment Act, CRA initiatives and focus comes from that, what is considered affordable housing, and that's the up to 80% of area median income. So that's kind of where I go. But I don't want to lose sight. There is this whole market dynamic. When you think about where we're at in Colorado, there's not a lot of affordable housing that falls into that meets the needs of someone in that 30 to 80% area median income. But as a developer, we are looking at low-income housing tax credits and that 80% or below area median income.
Thanks, Shelley. Brian and then Karen. If I ask you if something is affordable or would be affordable housing, how do you think about that?
Sure. Thank you again, Brian Rosbert with Housing Colorado. I think for me, whether we're talking market or subsidized, that around 30% number always kind of sticks with me, right? Like that's what it means to be stably housed, whether you're paying market rate prices or you're kind of within that cohort that Shelley was talking about, that sort of utilizes the subsidized housing market. And we can, talk about those numbers in terms of rental and home ownership. But for me, affordable and affordability has to do with what the monthly household expenses look like, and spending, it's just kind of been time again studied and researched that to be stably housed, whether again you're in market rate housing or subsidized housing, that you're not spending more than around 30% of your income on housing related expenses. It means that there's money available in your monthly budget for other things like food and healthcare and a whole host of other expense categories. So that's what it means to me. That's what always comes top to mind when we have this conversation is, spending around 30% of your income on housing.
So Brian, I'm going to follow up and I'll also open this to the group as we continue with the questions. A lot of times we hear the 30% number or people base requirements on a state median income. Is that a fair way for us to be approaching whether this is affordable for Coloradans with disabilities? Or do we need to also be looking at some income questions and some additional subsidies that are available? How should we be thinking about affordability and inventory for Coloradans with disabilities?
Sure. That's a really good follow-up and a really good uh, place to think about on, we don't necessarily talk a lot about the income side of things and increasing the income, whether we're talking about folks without disabilities or with disabilities, whether the minimum wage is enough to cover housing costs, whether we don't really talk about that income side of things a whole lot. And maybe that's a good conversation for us to have is, are there other income streams that could help benefit folks, and particularly folks with disabilities, that helps with the housing side of things.
Thanks. And to be very clear, in any of these conversations, you'll hear me throw things out. It's not me proposing or recommending. It's just me challenging the thinking to really get us to push and not take the easy path on these conversations. Going to go to Karen and then Cassidy with this question of, if somebody says, is it affordable? How do you think about that? What's the most simple way to break that down?
Thanks. Karen with Habitat Colorado. I mean, I would just echo what Brian has said. I'm being in affordable housing. I'm ingrained in the 30% of your income. And again, just to echo what Brian said, I mean, that has been studied, that has been looked at, and that goes back to, again, making sure you have money for other necessities so that you're not having to make hard choices. Are you going to pay your rent? Or are you going to put food on your table? Is that perfect? I don't know, but it's a way to look at it in terms of making sure that, we talk about cost burden and severely cost burden, and when you're paying over, 30% being cost burden, and when you're paying over 50% of your income, severely cost burden. So, yeah, I really look at it in terms of that percent of what you're paying from your income. I think that also, going to your question, Barrick, in terms of like, I don't know, it does allow, if you think about it, it allows that kind of, I would use the word sliding scale, right? So if you're making, I'm going to use numbers versus percentages, AMI percentages. If you're making 40,000 versus 60,000, that payment is going to be less. So again, it allows that adjustable way of looking at things too. So
thank you. Cassidy and then Jennifer. What does affordable even mean?
Yeah, I mean, I would mostly just echo what has been said. I think the 30% thing, it's difficult for when folks are, particularly folks who are living on their Social Security checks, and 30% of that, I don't believe would leave enough for those other necessities for a lot of folks in the community. And then the other thing I think about too for affordability is folks who need those structural modifications, buyers and renters. I think modifications are extremely expensive depending on what your needs are. And so I think I would just be sure to factor that into the equation as well. And I think highlights another reason why the 30% might not be equitable across the board.
Thanks, Cassidy. Jennifer, your thoughts?
I'm not sure that rent and stuff is affordable for most Coloradoans anyway right now, especially if you're a single income or single parent situation. But at least we have the potential to go out and increase our education, our incomes, that kind of stuff. Those primarily are on Social Security, some kind of restricted income. They're not going to be able to grow their income. So if they're paying the majority of their $900, $1,200 a month Social Security on rent or a house payment, and there's other costs in home ownership of maintenance of equipment and stuff like that, So they're not going to have any income to fall back on. So affordability, I think, is the perspective of those who have the money. Most of the people I work with are either on Social Security disability or Social Security, and there's no increases coming for them. And their increases may be, you know, a 3% increase, but in Colorado, our rents and our cost of living, our groceries, everything has gone up. And so affordability, I think, is a struggle for everybody, but especially those on a fixed income.
I appreciate that, Jennifer. I'm going to move us to the next topic, but I'm going to do so with an ask of all of you on the issue of affordability. We will come to affordability again on our next call. And what I would like to ask all of you to think about between now and then is, how should we be looking at affordability? I think it's pretty clear that we can't just say, does it meet the 30% of Colorado's median income test? So we probably need to look at some factor related to fixed incomes. Do we need to go get some data? And I will be transparent, I don't even know what exists, but I'm going to look to you to tell us what you would need to understand what affordability means to Coloradans with disabilities. And again, understanding that Coloradans with disabilities don't all automatically mean they make $67,400. We're looking at a whole range. So I'd like to invite all of you to think between now and our next meeting about what you would want to look at to understand inventory versus affordability aligned with the constituency that we're here to talk about, which is Coloradans with disabilities, which means a whole range of different disabilities. It means a range of geographic locations. It means a range of income or financial conditions. But for us to be able to make recommendations back to the legislature on whether there are affordable options, it seems we're going to need to get a little smarter on affordability. So my ask of all of you, and we'll follow up by email, is to come to our next meeting ready to talk about what does affordable really look like and how do we need to think about it. What I want to do, though, is move us to inventory. And that's one of the things we're specifically tasked with, looking at what is the current inventory and what are the future projected needs. Now, we can probably bring in some demographers and some others to talk about Colorado doubling in size, it seems, every 15 years and what demands that means. We're going to lean on all of you again for what types that means. But I want to talk right now about what are all of the subcategories within inventory. Because just like with affordability, the inventory is not a single issue where we could say, well, Colorado has 34,000 units available because they all have a ramp on them. What does inventory mean? What does it mean what types of physical building issues and modifications do we need to think about? What types of geographic distribution do we need to think about? Do we need to think about inventory by urban, suburban, and rural? Do we need to be looking at it by where our population growths are? Do we need to be looking at where Coloradans with disabilities live? Do we need to be making sure that every community in Colorado has sufficient inventory for every person who wants to make Colorado their home? Does it mean one-bedroom apartments? Does it mean a family of 5? Does it mean single-family homes? Does it mean multi-story? All of this to say, when somebody says, do we have enough inventory? That's oversimplifying it, obviously. So I'm going to go around. Cassidy, I'm going to start with you first and then go to Anais. And my question for you is, what's your brain dump on all of the different crosstabs or columns in a spreadsheet you'd want to be able to look at to say, do we have the inventory for everybody, everywhere, in every point in their life?
Yeah, I think I would want to spend more time thinking about this question, but I think, like, geographically speaking, I think distilling it to like a county level would be helpful. And I mean, I don't know, I actually am unfamiliar with if we have even data out there about how many people with disabilities are in each county. And I know that looks differently, and what they would actually need in terms of housing would be a lot different. But I'm thinking about that geographically, we need kind of diverse data across the state. And then as far as, what the individual units would look like, I think we do need to kind of break it out into number of bedrooms, because a lot of folks with disabilities don't live alone, they can't live alone, or they just have family members. So I think that's something I would want to look at as well in terms of inventory. And then as far as how the unit is structurally modified, I know, and this is just probably in my head from recent research I was doing for something else, but HUD did a study in 2011 where they talked about something that's modifiable as a category, something that's livable as a category, and then something that's wheelchair accessible. So I would want to play with those categories more and see exactly what the factors are for each of those. But I think just at first blush, that sounds like a good way to maybe group different kinds of accessible units.
I appreciate it. And Cassidy, I appreciate you being willing to be the first person I put on the spot. And I think this highlights why it's just not possible for us to solve any one of these on a single phone call. It's let's tease out just how complex and complicated this is, and then in between, think about it. So we will follow up by email and ask you to keep thinking on this question as well. I'm going to go to Anais and then Paul. What are those 20, 40, or 80 different columns and types of things we need to think about when somebody simplifies it down to inventory?
Yeah, I can give you three that I've thought of so far. I think the main issues that we're concerned that keeps us up all night is three things. Data on aging caregivers. So I know a lot of the individuals who would be relying on Social Security as income, who might not be able to work themselves, they rely heavily on their parents and those caregivers that are aging out. So really trying to understand what it's going to look like in 10, 20, 30 years when there's an influx of individuals who no longer have caregivers taking care of them and providing their needs aside from their supplemental income. And so one of those is that. And then the units and vouchers for extremely low income individuals. So that person, Joe, that I just brought up, who relies on Social Security, that $943 a month. Is there inventory for those individuals? Is Joe going to be able to find housing either through a voucher or some type of government or community program? And then access to public transportation. And this relates to those aging caregivers and those individuals that rely heavily on their natural supports to get to where they need to go, like medical appointments, to get their needs met, to go to grocery stores, right? So what's the geographic data on access to public transportation?
Thank you. Paul and then Shelley.
So Paul, I guess I don't know if the county level will work. For instance, Douglas County, Eagle County, Larimer, El Paso, like they all have urban, suburban, and rural parts to those counties, and the solution is going to be very different for those. Elevators is a huge tipping point in this conversation, or vertical living in general. And so that kind of brings me into my next class of inventory, but it's apartments versus everything else. So those elevator buildings that have stacked flats, they naturally are a more accessible dwelling type than everything else. Currently under the current codes, once you have an elevator in a single story living, you have to meet those federal requirements. If you're multi-story or 4 units or less or detached, they're exempt. And so understanding it between those two, and then I guess a final one would be new versus reuse. I don't know if it's fair for us to assume everybody deserves access to a new house. And that's maybe a controversial statement to say, but they're expensive, they're nice, they're modern. It's a sign of privilege. It's not a basic need, I guess, to be in a new structure. And so looking at the distinction between new versus reuse, because a legislation that addresses modifications to that reuse existing housing stock is going to have a greater impact, I think, than to the new housing stock.
Thank you. Shelley and Brian.
Shelley Marquez, Mercy Housing. I guess I would agree with Paul of, when you think about new and existing housing stock, how are we, and I think for existing housing stock, one thing that comes to mind is, how has existing housing stock kept up with accessibility requirements and codes, and ensuring that it's still meeting the needs. I think looking at, it'd be important to look at CHAFA data to see what's required. There's so many units being developed every year. How many of those units are accessible today? But not only on the low-income housing tax credit side, but I'm also thinking about market rate. What is CBRE doing to around accessibility in developing new as well as existing? So I'm just going down the path of thinking the development side and what is some of the data we could pull from these resources. I do like the comments made around geographic location, and hearing Jennifer's comment, like, you can build accessible units, but if the infrastructure isn't there for someone to be able to even get out, that's something to be mindful. I don't know that this task force, or maybe there is things that the task force can look at to ensure that it's not just developing accessible housing, but ensuring that the infrastructure around it is also accessible.
Thank you, Shelley. I'm going to go to Brian and then Karen. As I do, I also want to revisit what it means when we say we're going to offer recommendations. I think a lot of times these task force and work groups, we jump to the only recommendations we're going to make are legislative, that we're going to say they should pass this law or they should spend this money. And I want to keep that on the table. I also want you all to feel very open to other types of recommendations. You may recommend that the legislature require certain things or appropriate certain funds. You may also want to recommend that county governments or county offices or nonprofits and NGOs and communities and developers have different types of partnerships or approaches. So we should think about policy, regulations, as well as best practices and ideas that can be rolled out independent of what our legislature may do. Brian and then Karen. Brian, when we talk about inventory, how do we get away from that just being a single class, and what are the different types of inventory we need to look at?
Yeah, I think folks have mentioned several different ways. I am trying to envision the columns on the spreadsheet, or the crosstabs that you mentioned, Barrick. So we can go through some of the things that the zoning code requires, as Paul was talking about, R2, R3, what's required in multifamily, what's required. I think there's going to be a gap between what's required and what's actually out there. And I don't, I want us to try and get the best perspective that we can on what is the current inventory. And so thinking about things in terms of specifically designed units, those that are adaptable as they currently stand. And then, I think one of the harder inventory questions we're going to probably wrestle with is what has already been, what's already sort of in the reuse arena. I think of, a family who has installed a ramp and roll-in shower in their existing single family detached unit. How do we account for that in our inventory question, when it's not something that is as easy as going to say, CHAFA and saying, okay, part of the qualified allocation plan is X, or have you tracked the number of units that have met that requirement over the last 12 years? That gets us to a number in our subsidized housing in terms of what the inventory looks like there. So I'm struggling with the question. I think it's a very big one. And I think I'll need to think about that and just start writing down I guess the column headers, to use your analogy, and just start there.
I appreciate everybody indulging as I don't ask the easy questions, because I don't want the easy questions that don't get to the solutions that are meaningful. And I don't want anybody to feel that if you don't have all the answers, there was something off in the conversation. I want to challenge our thinking. I want us to really push for our recommendations again, to look at other ideas as the floor, not the ceiling, to ours. So Brian, I appreciate that. I'm going to ask everybody to keep thinking between the meetings. Karen, and then up to Jennifer.
So Karen with Habitat Colorado. I agree. I've been sitting here thinking this is an overwhelming question. We don't even have a good handle on just housing inventory and the need in general for Colorado. And that is something, when Brian mentioned earlier, the strategic growth legislation that we're looking at, I do think we have, like timing of our subcommittee, there is a lot of legislation that's going on right now where I think there's transit-oriented development legislation, and could we make recommendations around that? And I'm kind of veering from the question. Maybe it's because it's so overwhelming to come up with those headers, but could we make recommendations in terms of that yes, that we're looking at accessible housing as part of that, and that's a priority. Or again, I think we have an opportunity in the strategic growth legislation to look at this. I mean, again, when I think about categories in general, we typically are looking at, again, what is the AMI? Are they currently paying too much for housing? I think we've acknowledged more than once that there's a spectrum of disabilities, and terms of physical disabilities, some of the hidden disabilities. I do think, going back to, I think Cassidy was the one that did make the comment about looking at things from a county perspective. I do think that geography does come into play. And I think that's how we're looking at things in terms of some of the housing needs assessments. And so I would say, again, I don't know exactly what the questions are, but I think, thinking through this and trying to utilize that strategic growth that is looking at counties or regional needs, I think this somehow needs to tie into that.
Thank you.
And I have to go.
Yeah.
I'm going to take my thing off for like 2 minutes. I apologize. I will be right back.
That's quite all right. No apology. Thank you. Then, Jennifer.
Yes, Jennifer Casera. One of the things in finding the inventory, I think breaking it down of where is that inventory? Is it in more urban or rural areas? Breaking it down by county probably is the most, the logical thing to do, but some of those counties are very large. Part of it is incorporated, some is incorporated. I personally live in an incorporated area of Arapahoe County. So most of our governing is more by county than by state. So I think there's a lot of different perspectives to look out to find where that inventory is and where we can project the future need. Some of those unincorporated areas may be good places to put affordable housing, but is the towns and the areas around it able to sustain the needs of those we're putting in that housing area? So I think we need to look at a lot of different perspectives, because all counties are not made equally. They're different shapes, different sizes, different populations, some incorporated, some not incorporated. Some towns aren't even, cities. They don't have a structure or a government. So we need to identify where that need is and where that inventory is.
Thank you. And this kind of tees us up perfectly for what's the next item on the agenda. Paul, did you have some?
May I just add one more? It might, as everybody was talking, I think I might have two pointed sources to go to. It's the assessor and building permit data records. Our assessor is going to break it down by zip code, year built, number of units on a site, and then any building permit stuff is going to tell us type of construction, which we can inform, is it vertical or not, number of units, that type of stuff. So those might be really rich data sources.
Paul, it's like you're reading my mind and we're channeling here. That's what I want to ask you all about next. In a few minutes, Carrie's going to talk about stakeholder engagement because we want your help in identifying who else we need to talk to. But first, as I said at the top, today's conversation wasn't to solve. It was two parts. It was one for all of us to get a little clarity on how unclear the ask is and how complex this is, just to start the gears thinking. The other part is I want to use this to start identifying what you all need to help inform these conversations, and whether that's we need this type of data and I have no idea where you're going to get it, Barrick, but go find it, or if it's something like Paul just offered. I think this is a good place. So I'm going to go around the room again. Brian, I'm going to start with you and then go to Karen. And it's a two-part question. You can answer either of them. One, what is the data? What is the information you need that would help you to have a conversation about what is the available inventory and what is the future need for that going to be? Either what's the data you need, or what sources of data do you already know of that we should be pulling into this conversation?
Thanks, Barrick. Brian Rosbert with Housing Colorado. Yeah, trying to put our thumb on the existing inventory is something that's going to be vital. I think putting that next to the projected need is also going to be important to understand what the current gap is. I think some sources that, at least in in the subsidized world, and maybe Paul is starting off in the direction of trying to name some of those sources. I can think of, like, in the subsidized world, like I mentioned earlier, CHAFA, just looking at what is required to be built there to get low-income housing tax credits or other forms of subsidy, through the Division of Housing or otherwise. Like, what requirements do they have? What's been built, and sort of extrapolate from there, or unless they have a unit count. Like, that gets us some numbers. In the market rate world, I'm sure there's something similar that could some mathing that could happen in terms of, okay, this market rate development got built. There's this requirement for accessibility in, say, Denver County. Okay, what out of those 200 units, what actually then got built that is an accessible unit? I'm just sort of thinking out loud of, like, what some data sources might be. So yeah, I think that number and that gap are going to be really important to any recommendations that we make. And our work is really about, like, how to fill that gap. So that's what I think I need, our starting point, and then whether it's the demographer's office or other projections for what our population is going to look like, and any extrapolation from that projection data around disabilities will be important.
Thank you. And I want to be very transparent. This conversation right now is exactly what hit me when I was looking at the scope of our work. That if somebody simply said, analyze what the inventory is of affordable housing, that's complex enough, because we have to look at what income is county by county, community by community, projected economic development and growth. Now we're talking about affordability for specific populations that are not a monolith. It's not, as we've been talking about, that affordability simply means X. So I'm asking these questions with the full awareness that it's a complex issue. We probably won't get it all sorted today. And there's going to be some data we need that may not exist in a clean place. But I want us to think as ambitiously as possible about what data or research we would need and or from whom to be able to even understand what inventory exists and what inventory is needed to serve this population that is being painted with this broad brush of Coloradans with disabilities. I'm going to go to Karen and then up to Shelley.
Again, I end up coming after Brian, and I agree with everything Brian said. I would just say ditto, but I guess I would build on that. I mean, we've talked a lot about getting data from CHAFA. I think Division of Housing, I mean, they do have requirements for when you're getting state funding or federal funding. So what currently is being built, what do they have in their queue, what has been built, even knowing when we have to give demographic information to the Division of Housing, we state whether or not they call them beneficiaries that we're working with in terms of the funding streams. You know, do they have a disability? Are they over a certain age? So I think it would be interesting just to know what data they have at their fingertips in terms of this. I echo the demographer's office just in terms of, I just think our aging population you know, right now it's an issue in terms of our seniors wanting to downsize and there isn't anything affordable. And so just, again, understanding that in terms of being to age in place would be interesting too. And yeah, I think those would be some of my suggestions for starting places.
Thank you.
And what Brian said.
Yeah. Shelley and then Paul, what data or data sources come to mind for you if we're going to really try to understand the inventory and the inventory needs?
Yeah, thank you. Shelley Marquez, Mercy Housing. I would echo, I'm following Brian and Karen, and we're all part of the affordable housing community. So I think thinking about statewide data, CHAPA could be a great resource when we're thinking about affordable housing development. They should be able to provide data. Division of Housing, as Karen had shared, they have, they're providing a lot of subsidies or grants or loans. And so they've been a great data resource for a lot of developers as we think about resources that, and so for me, it's the demographer it'd be helpful to understand what are we seeing as far as the need in this across the state, and how is the disability community, is it growing? Are the needs changing? What does that look like? So having any data around that would be what I would offer at this point.
Thanks, Shelley. Paul and then Anais. And Paul, you've already given us a few. Do you have additional thoughts?
They just go to the population and types of disabilities. How many are mobility impaired? How many are visually impaired or hearing impaired? So that we can understand the solutions that are needed for those populations, for the quantity.
Thank you. Anais and then Cassidy.
Yeah, in addition to what Paul said, thinking about those clients who make $11K a year with Social Security. So really wanting to know, because they would rely heavily on vouchers, right? So that would be their main source, or that Section 8. So really looking at the local data of the existing inventory of vouchers and units that are affordable for these individuals, and see how they compare to the actual data, to the actual need of the community members. And as an advocate, I'm always a proponent of getting data on the lived experience of individuals with disabilities. So a lot of data that can speak to, what challenges individuals with disabilities face, what preferences they have. I believe that regardless of a disability, you're an expert in your own life. So really hearing from the community that we're serving and that we're working towards and understanding what they feel like their needs are, I think would be great data to inform the solutions that we come up with.
Thank you. Cassidy and then Jennifer.
Yeah, I would definitely echo what Anais just said. And then I think also just like basic data is like number of people with disabilities, the types of disabilities, and like the needs that come from those disabilities in terms of what they would need maybe structurally in a unit. And then like, I guess just data around, how many accessible type A, type B units, and then, where are they by city or county? And then to Paul's point, like what kind, urban, suburban, rural. So kind of having the inventory categorized in that way, I think would be helpful. And then additionally, like single family homes, how many are already built to be accessible? How many are existingly accessible? And I guess what type of accessibility that is, but having that categorized out as well.
Thank you. Jennifer.
Jennifer Casera. Yeah, I think it's to find that inventory. It's not just the location. It's what is the need in that location. How many of those are needing physical or other modifications to homes to be able to live safely and comfortably. But to go off of what Karen said about older adults and aging in place, there's a lot of baby boomers entering the system right now. They're having problems downsizing to affordable housing. Either there's not affordable housing around there, or the housing isn't within their income range. So not just the location, but who is in that location, and do we see a lot of older adults in that area aging into the system within the next 5 to 10 years? So have a projection of what we're going to need in the future as well.
Thank you, Jennifer. We're at just about 5 minutes left, and I'm going to bring Carrie in to talk about some of the stakeholder engagement. I want to thank everybody for going down some rabbit holes and being comfortable with non-closure on some of these discussions. I appreciated, everybody going down the path of just how complex this is. As I said, we're going to follow up after the meeting and ask you to continue giving some thoughts. We may ask you to complete a brief Google form or just to email us with your thoughts on our earlier conversations about what it means when we say affordability, and particularly on this of how we need to be looking at the question of inventory, inventory for whom, where, and what that means, whether that means modified or built, rental or purchased, and what that affordability and accessibility looks like for different communities. One of the things that I mentioned up top, we're grateful for all of your time. We also know that nobody here could pretend to speak for every Coloradan with a disability. What we do need you to help us do is think about all of the stakeholders here, from those with lived experience to those who may be part of the solutions, whether that's developers, county inspectors, state officials, other communities or groups, and what stakeholders we want to engage. We don't have a specific, we're going to do focus groups on February 19th. What we want to do is keep leaning on you throughout this process of, hey, is this an issue where we need to get some broader input? To do that, we have a lot of different tools at our disposal, and one of them I'm going to ask Carrie to talk about now.
Sure, thanks, Barrick. Just to back up just a second, in terms of data and what you guys all need, I want to invite you all to please blow up my email. If you have things that you would like to share with the group, we'll create a shared drive or something that's easy for everybody to get to. If you just have things you think would be helpful for this group to think about, we can put that in the shared drive and share with everybody, so we can be as informed as possible. To that note, and I'm glad somebody brought it up earlier about stakeholder engagement and lived experience. We are working with Dora. They have this wonderful tool called Engage Dora. You can go to engagedora.org It is specifically a community engagement platform. I'm working with Katie over at Dora right now to create a page that is specifically dedicated to this task force. We'll have a subpage for the housing subcommittee in particular. You guys will be able, it's a pretty basic website. You'll be able to go online. You can see all the meeting materials, notes, upcoming meetings, recorded videos of past meetings. But we can also work together to create some kind of survey for the community. And if it is specific to those with lived experience, we want people to be able to share their stories with this task force. That's a really important piece of data that we need to gather. We need to hear from the people who are most closely affected, as well as the assessor's office and all that kind of data. The lived experience is important too. So we can invite, I'll share a link with you guys as soon as it is live, but Dora has one task force up right now. It's a homeowners rights task force. If you wanted to just check it out to see what the format will look like, Katie and I should have our subcommittee pages live this week. But we can use it a lot of different ways. We can create surveys for the public. We can try and collect data there. There's a lot of different things we can do. So if you guys want to just check that out, that will be upcoming for us also and useful for the remainder of the year. Back to you, Barrett.
Thanks, Gary. And we're at 2 minutes. My promise is to always wrap these up on time. I know how calendars get. As I said, we'll follow up with some specific questions or some asks for you to either send us your ideas or to be thinking between now and the next meeting. I think we're going to continue on the inventory conversation, and our second conversation piece of that will be affordability. Those are very complex, but obviously interwoven topics. So we'll follow up with those questions. We'll follow up with the email, and as Carrie mentioned, give you a link to engage Dora so you can start checking that out. My final ask will be to start thinking about who we may want to engage and hear from as we go through these conversations, in particular around inventory and around affordability. And whether that's Barrick, we'd love to hear from the state demographer, or Barrick, I think it's really important to hear from this community or these professionals. Give that some thought. All of this will follow up in an email, and I just want to thank all of you for giving us an hour and a half of your time on a Monday morning and for helping us to break down what somebody wanted to think were really simple issues, and obviously are not going to be, but I think we've got the right group, and if we work ambitiously for the next 10 months, we'll be able to put forward some powerful recommendations. So with that, I'm just going to thank you all for your time. We will follow up with notes from today and some specific asks, and we will see you next month to continue the conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks all.